There is a specific kind of anger that arrives already knowing it is right. Not hot, not chaotic. It has a shape, a target, a list of reasons the target deserves it. The bad driver who cut you off without signaling. The coworker who speaks confidently about things they do not understand. The political figure whose face alone produces something in your chest before they have even spoken. The anger arrives complete, preloaded with justification, already holding its verdict, needing nothing from you except permission to continue, and you give it permission because the justification is real. The driver really did cut you off. The coworker really is overconfident. The political figure really does represent something you find genuinely objectionable. The anger has evidence. It is not irrational, and you are not irrational for feeling it. This is the first and most important thing the anger needs you to believe. Because the anger is not a response to what happened. Not entirely. Not at the level that actually matters. What you are experiencing as outrage at the specific, legitimate, observable, justifiable target in front of you is doing a second job underneath its stated purpose. One that the anger has been doing for years without your full awareness. It is holding something down. It is preventing something else from surfacing. It is working extremely hard on your behalf to make sure you never feel the thing that is actually driving it. The mechanism has a name. Jung called it displacement, not in the casual sense that word has acquired, but in the precise sense. The psychic energy that belongs to one emotion gets attached to a different object, one that is safer to feel toward, more socially acceptable, more legible as justified, more available as a target. The original emotion does not disappear. Psychic energy does not dissolve. It finds a channel, and chronic anger is one of the most efficient channels the psyche has ever developed. It keeps the real thing moving without ever letting it reach the surface. The promise here is not that you will stop being angry. The promise is more specific and more uncomfortable, that you will be able to see what the anger is covering. Not so that you can feel better about it, so that you can stop living at one remove from yourself. If this channel is where you come to think about what you haven't been willing to name, subscribe. This is that kind of work. And the reason the covering is so effective is structural. It is built into what anger does as an emotional state, not into anything particular about you. Anger is structurally superior to the emotions it replaces, not morally, but psychologically, in terms of what it allows you to do and what it protects you from having to do. When you are afraid something is happening to you, you are subject to it, unable to fully control what it does inside you. Fear requires acknowledging a gap between what you can handle and what is being asked of you. The admission that something has enough power over you to frighten you. That admission is costly. For someone who has organized their self-understanding around not being the person who cannot handle things, it may be genuinely intolerable. Anger closes that gap. It moves the energy outward. It transforms something that was happening to you into something you are doing to something else. The target is now the problem. The target receives the energy that belonged to the fear, and you, in the act of directing the anger, are no longer the vulnerable one. You are the one holding the verdict. Grief works similarly. Grief requires accepting a loss. Accepting a loss means accepting that something mattered enough to hurt you when it went, that you were attached, that you are the kind of person who can be hurt by attachment. For the person who has decided, at some level below conscious articulation, that attachment is weakness, or that the way to stay safe is to stay unaffected. Grief is inadmissible, so the grief goes somewhere else. It becomes irritability. It becomes the sudden disproportionate fury at minor obstacles. It becomes the inexplicable rage at someone who is mildly inconsiderate, because mildly inconsiderate in the moment sits on top of everything that was never mourned. You are not angry at the driver. You are angry through the driver. Here is the behavior you have probably never had named exactly this way. There are situations that make you angrier than the situation warrants. You know this somewhere, even as the anger arrives, and the excess does not feel like excess. It feels like proportionate response. It feels like finally responding appropriately to something that has been insufficiently responded to for a long time, because it has been. That part is accurate. Something has been insufficiently responded to for a long time. The anger is not lying about the intensity. It is lying about the address. There is a pattern to the targets if you look at it from outside. The specific kind of person who keeps producing the reaction. The specific situation that keeps generating the heat. The coworker is not just overconfident. They are overconfident about exactly the thing you feel most uncertain of. The political figure is not just wrong. They embody a specific quality you were punished for wanting. The bad driver is not merely inconsiderate. They are moving through the world with exactly the carelessness you were trained never to allow yourself. The targets are not random. They are recruited. The anger finds them because they rhyme with something, with a loss, a shame, a fear, a need that was marked as inadmissible, and uses their surface features as the occasion to move the older, deeper energy that has been looking for a channel. Dostoevsky understood this better than most psychologists who came after him. His Underground Man, the narrator of Notes from Underground, arguably the most psychologically honest voice in 19th century fiction, is a man who has refined his own resentment into a complete worldview. He knows in excruciating and articulate detail what he is doing. He can describe his own patterns with a precision that should, in theory, be enough to break them. And he keeps doing it anyway, because the thing the resentment is protecting him from, genuine contact with other people, genuine vulnerability, the risk of being dismissed or rejected by someone whose dismissal would actually matter, is more frightening than the corrosive cost of maintaining the rage. What Dostoevsky saw, and what most therapeutic frameworks still struggle to fully accommodate, is that the resentment is not confusion. It is not a mistake. It is a solution to a problem the person has decided they cannot face any other way. The underground man is not trapped in his resentment. He is hiding in it. The hideout is chosen, and the intelligence that could identify the hiding is instead recruited to its service. This is the specific mechanism that makes pattern-based anger so resistant to examination. The analytical capacity that should be the instrument of change becomes one of the pattern's most sophisticated defenses. The perceptive person who is also chronically angry has access to abundant evidence, real evidence, that their targets deserve what they are receiving. They can build the case. They are often partially right. The targets often do have the qualities attributed to them, and the partial accuracy becomes the cover. You can be completely correct about someone's failings and still be using those failings to avoid something else entirely. The question is not whether the anger is justified. It is what the justified anger is carrying. Before that, though, the question of where the anger comes from is not simply historical. There is a version of this insight that is easy to receive and easier to use incorrectly. You hear that your chronic anger is displaced grief or fear, and you immediately begin auditing your past for the originating wound. You construct a genealogy. You identify the relationship, the period, the specific series of events that produced the suppression, and then you treat the genealogy as the work. As if naming the origin were the same as changing the dynamic. It is not. And the reason is something the underground man demonstrates without ever stating it explicitly. The intelligence that builds the genealogy is the same intelligence that runs the pattern. The archaeology of your own anger can be recruited to the service of the anger with the same efficiency as everything else. You become very sophisticated about the mechanism while continuing to inhabit it, now with an explanation that makes the inhabitation feel like understanding. This is the specific way that intelligent people get stuck. Not because they lack access to the insight, but because the insight, once acquired, becomes another object to carry into the anger's organization. The anger finds a way to use it. The person who has done real psychological reading is often more thoroughly defended than the person who hasn't, because they can name everything they are doing in clinical language while continuing to do it. And the naming feels like progress. Dostoevsky was writing about this in 1864 and has not been improved on. The underground man is not stupid about himself. He is extraordinarily astute. The astuteness is part of what traps him. Knowledge of the mechanism, without the willingness to feel what the mechanism is protecting against, is just a more sophisticated version of the same evasion. Consider a situation that is less comfortable than the bad driver. Think about the last time you were angry at someone's ease, not their arrogance, their ease. The person who does the thing effortlessly that costs you enormous effort. The colleague whose work is consistently better than yours without apparent strain. The person who occupies a room with a quality of self-possession you find yourself watching and cannot quite describe without the word contempt arriving alongside the observation. The contempt is almost certainly real. But what is it composed of? There is envy in it. That much is legible. But beneath the envy, something that costs more to name, the grief of a self that was not permitted to develop what they are displaying. The mourning for a capacity, a path, a version of yourself that was foreclosed before you fully understood it was available. Not because anyone was cruel in a way you can hold on to, sometimes because the conditions were simply absent. The encouragement, the time, the models, the permission to want what you wanted before you learned that wanting it was inadmissible. The anger at their ease is grief at your own unlived possibility, arriving through the only channel the psyche found acceptable. This is what makes this variety of anger so durable. The target is not going to become less competent. The ease is not going to disappear, which means the grief it is carrying never gets processed through the anger because the anger cannot actually do what the grief requires. The channel stays open. The anger keeps arriving, attaching to new versions of the same kind of target, because the source is not a thing that can be resolved by directing fury at whoever is closest to the wound. Jung's concept of projection is adjacent to displacement but distinct, and the distinction matters precisely here. Projection is when a quality you cannot acknowledge in yourself gets attributed to someone else. Your own cruelty appearing to you as cruelty in others. Your own dishonesty registering as the dishonesty of everyone you meet. Displacement is different. It is not attributing a quality, but redirecting an energy. The anger at the person who is at ease with what cost you effort is not a projection of your own ease. You may have very little of it. It is real anger, belonging to something real, addressed to the wrong object. The two mechanisms often run together. The person who has suppressed their own need for rest will project a quality, laziness, onto someone who simply appears unhurried, and feel their displaced shame as contempt toward the projection. They stack. Which is part of why chronic, pattern-based anger is so difficult to examine from inside. You are not dealing with one dynamic. You are dealing with several, each providing cover for the others, each giving the system plausible deniability. And all of it, the full architecture, is organized around the same function, preventing contact with what is actually there. Jung's term for what the anger is keeping out of reach is the shadow, not as metaphor, as a specific psychological structure. The shadow is the psyche's repository for everything that did not fit, the emotions that were not permitted, the capacities that were not encouraged, the needs that were marked as inadmissible. It is not evil, it is what was left over. The standard version of this idea stops here, at the observation that the shadow contains repressed material. But the thing most treatments of the shadow don't say directly is this: the shadow's contents do not become unreachable despite the anger's efficiency. They become unreachable because of it. The anger does not merely distract from what is underneath. It actively maintains the conditions that keep the underneath unreachable. It provides a complete alternative orientation, a direction to face, a target to organize around, an energy expenditure that exhausts the capacity that might otherwise turn inward. This is why the shadow deepens with the anger rather than alongside it. Every time the displaced anger finds a new target and runs through its cycle, the heat, the justification, the verdict, the brief satisfaction of having a place to put the energy, the contents of the shadow become slightly more consolidated, slightly more remote. The gap between the surface life and what is held below it widens imperceptibly over time. Jung called the process of integrating what the shadow contains individuation. He was explicit that it is not comfortable. It does not feel in the early stages like liberation. It feels like something that was safely managed becoming unmanageable. The anger, when examined, begins to loosen, and what is underneath it begins to surface, which is precisely what the anger was organized to prevent. The grief, when it finally has nowhere to go but where it belongs, does not have a target. It does not have a narrative. It is simply there, undifferentiated, without the organizing function the anger provided. And sitting with that, without giving it a new target, without converting it into a more comfortable form, is the actual work. Frankl's contribution to this is specific and easy to misuse. He wrote that between every stimulus and every response, there is a space, a pause, however brief, in which something other than reflex is possible. He arrived at this through observation in conditions that stripped away almost every other kind of freedom, and he was therefore unusually precise about what the space does and does not allow. It does not allow you to simply choose a different emotion. The anger will arrive. That part is not under immediate control. What the space makes possible is a second observation, not instead of the anger, but alongside it. This anger is real, and something beneath it is also real, and they are not the same thing. That second observation is not a replacement for the anger. It is a crack in the architecture that the anger has built, a small opening in the certainty that the anger is about exactly what it says it is about. Most people never reach this second observation because the anger fills the space too completely. This is one of anger's primary features. It expands to occupy whatever room is available, and its expansion feels like clarity. From inside the anger feels like the accurate reading of the situation. The grief underneath it does not feel like grief. It does not feel like anything, because the anger has moved into its place and named the space its own. The second observation does not feel like insight when it first arrives. It feels more like a wrongness in the certainty, a faint sense that the intensity is slightly off, that the target and the heat do not quite add up, that something is running just slightly past the stated cause. This feeling is not comfortable. It does not arrive as relief. It arrives as a small instability in the story the anger has built. And the anger, when it detects this instability, will often intensify, because the instability is a threat to the architecture, and the architecture is designed to protect against exactly the kind of attention that produced it. The moment of second observation, in other words, may produce more anger before it produces anything else. This is not a sign that the observation was wrong. Marcus Aurelius had a related observation, though he framed it differently. He called it the first movement, the initial reaction of the body and psyche to a stimulus, which cannot be fully commanded. A loud sound startles you, and injustice produces heat. These are first movements, not failures of character, not evidence of weakness. What can be cultivated over time with effort is the second movement. Whether you follow the first movement into a sustained state, build a story around it, give it a target, and decide that the intensity is entirely about the stated cause. The anger that arrives when someone cuts you off in traffic, that is a first movement. What you do with it over the next 30 seconds, 30 minutes, the rest of the day, that is second movement territory. That is where the space Frankl described exists, not as a moment of rational override, but as the ongoing question of whether you are going to inhabit the anger as the full account, or hold the possibility that there is something it is not telling you about itself. There is something Dostoevsky noticed about his underground man that tends to get lost. The man is extraordinarily perceptive. He can see with unusual clarity what he is doing. He describes his own psychological mechanics with an accuracy that should be sufficient, in theory, for change. It is not sufficient, because perception alone, without the willingness to feel what the perception points toward, does not produce change. It produces more elaborate and more sophisticated versions of the same defense. The insight becomes another layer of the architecture. This is the last and most difficult thing about chronic anger. Intellectual understanding of it does not dissolve it. You can know, in full detail, that the anger at the coworker is displaced grief about your own unlived capacity. You can understand the mechanism, you can articulate the genealogy, and the anger can keep arriving. Because the grief it is carrying has not been felt, only named. Naming and feeling are not the same operation. There is no clean sequence from here. This needs to be said directly, because the alternative, offering a series of practices that converts the grief into something manageable and the fear into something productive, is exactly the betrayal that makes the work harder. Every time the insight is packaged into a technique, it becomes another thing to do with the anger rather than a way of stopping doing things with it. What is true? The grief that the anger has been holding down is real grief about real things. It does not become easier to feel when the anger loosens its hold. It becomes simply present, and present is not the same as resolved. The grief, when it has nowhere else to go, tends to arrive disproportionate to the current situation. This is one of the most disorienting features of what happens when the architecture begins to give. You feel about something minor or about nothing in particular, something enormous, not because the present warrants it, because the present is the first moment the accumulated weight has been allowed to arrive without being redirected. It will feel like breaking down about the wrong thing. It often will be about the wrong thing on the surface, and completely accurate at the level that matters. The fear that was managed by the anger tends to surface without a clear object. The anger always had a target. The fear underneath it is often responding to something that no longer exists in the same form, a person, a dynamic, a period, but that has not been formally updated in the psychic architecture. It feels irrational because it is. It is also real. And the irrationality is not evidence that it is wrong. It is evidence that it has been waiting. What changes when the anger releases is not the difficulty. It is the accuracy. The coworker whose competence no longer needs to serve as a target. The political figure whose face no longer requires the particular intensity that was doing two jobs at once. The minor daily frustrations that no longer carry the accumulated weight of everything that was never mourned. Not serenity, a slightly less distorted view of what is actually happening and what you are actually feeling at any given moment. Considerably less satisfying than the promise most frameworks make, considerably more real. What the work actually requires is the willingness to stay in the thing that is underneath, without immediately giving it a new target, without converting it into analysis, without making it the subject of an interesting essay about yourself, rather than something that is simply present and uncomfortable and in need of being sat with rather than explained. The explanation is available. It has been available to you throughout this. The feeling the explanation is pointing at is something else entirely. You will know something has shifted when you catch yourself mid-anger, not in the sense of stopping it, but in the sense of noticing a second thing alongside it, the anger at the driver. And beneath it simultaneously something that arrived before the anger arrived and that the anger immediately moved to cover, something quieter, less organized, without a target, without a justification, something that is not asking for a verdict, that noticing is not resolution. The pattern has been running long enough that it does not end with a single observation, but it is the beginning of a different relationship to what has been driving you, not the stated target, not the surface cause, but the older, quieter, more costly thing that the anger has been working so efficiently to keep out of sight. The anger knew exactly what it was protecting. You are only now beginning to find out. And finding out is not a conclusion. It is the beginning of a different kind of attention, one that does not let the anger run its full narrative without at least registering the gap between the stated cause and the actual intensity. A small friction introduced into a system that was previously frictionless, not freedom. Something more honest than freedom. The ongoing, effortful, incomplete practice of knowing what you are actually doing and staying in that knowledge instead of letting the anger smooth it over. If something in that landed, leave a comment that says, "I've been angry at the wrong thing."